Before the parade, mass draft card burning was urged. Demonstrators claimed 200 cards were burned, but no accurate count could be determined. Reporters and onlookers were jostled away on purpose.
It's clearly our side, I believe, that's the aggressor in Vietnam. I think the real question, of course, is one that he hasn't answered yet. Does he really mean that we're going to withdraw our troops and not insist that our puppets stay in charge in South Vietnam?
The 19th century Prussian military strategist Karl von Clausewitz, in his essays on war, summed up the purpose of Army logistics perfectly. Bring every gun, man, and horse to the battlefield in the shortest possible time and with the utmost momentum. Though a century has passed, the goal remains the same. And at Vietnam today, that's what American logisticians are trying to do.
The debris of war, 450 acres of it, the biggest scrapyard in the world, and one of the monuments the Americans will leave behind as they pull out of Vietnam. The rest is sold, much of it simply as scrap metal, sawn up and neutered.
The bulk of the supplies and equipment sent to Vietnam begin their journey on the west coast of the United States. Delivered to the docks for shipment overseas is everything necessary to equip, transport, and maintain our army in Vietnam. Everything from food, small arms, ammunition, and medical supplies to helicopters and heavy weapons must be delivered to our fighting men. That material is brought into Vietnam by the ports of Saigon, Newport, Quy Nhon, Da Nang, and Cam Ranh Bay. From there, it moves inland to regions closer to combat, where support depots are established. The rapid buildup of U.S. forces in Vietnam in 1965 overloaded the limited port facilities at Saigon, the capital city of South Vietnam. At any given time, there were as many as 40 given ships waiting in the harbor for a place to unload. South Vietnamese and U.S. Army transportation officials cooperated to clear the traffic jam, expanding and modernizing the existing port. But Saigon's facilities are still heavily burdened. More than 200,000 tons of military cargo are unloaded here on an average month, plus an equal amount of commercial cargo. Once the supplies are off the ship and on the pier, maneuvering through Saigon's crowded city streets can be a navigational nightmare. To ease the load on Saigon, Americans built a new transport terminal 3.5 miles upstream, dubbed Newport, which has 4 piers that can accommodate heavy cargo vessels. A steady flow of equipment and supplies stream in from various U.S. Army depots. But it's the Cam Ranh Bay on the South China Sea where the full extent of the United States Army logistical buildup in Vietnam can be most dramatically illustrated. In 1965, these shores were a sandy wasteland. Army engineers got the job of turning the area into a major service and supplies base. Everything had to be built from scratch, creating a base supporting everything for total troop and combat support. A special type of docking area, known as the De Long Pier, handles thousands of tons of ammunition daily. The large barge-like platform is located for safety's sake at the end of a long causeway, which is supported by steel pilings driven into the bottom of the bay. De Long piers are in wide use at many South Vietnam coastal supply points. Petroleum products for American aircrafts and vehicles are also handled at specially built facilities. This jetty at Cam Ranh Bay can accommodate large tankers that pump petroleum at the weight of over 400,000 gallons an hour. The petroleum is stored at a tank farm several miles inland. What was formerly a sleepy fishing village has become a dynamic modern port, capable of offloading, processing, and transporting immense quantities of urgently needed military supplies and equipment. Nearly 25% of all the military logistical supplies coming into the country enter here at Cam Ranh Bay.
I have a letter addressed to all personnel of this command from the commanding general. During our tour in the Republic of Vietnam, we have all seen what communism can do to a struggling nation in our world community. It is therefore most important that we conduct our affairs with the people of the Republic of Vietnam in a manner that will show the Vietnamese citizen that we are his friends and that we are here to assist him in the improvement as well as the security of his country. It is then with great pride that I note the fine work done by the soldiers of this command during the recent operation. It is with pleasure that I say, a job well done.
In the unpredictable coming of war, supplies often must be concentrated in areas where port facilities are either inadequate or entirely unavailable. In these cases, ships anchor off coast and cargo is unloaded over the side into lighters. Known as over-the-shore operations, this method of bringing in material adds considerable flexibility to the Army's supply activity. The extent of the logistical problem in Vietnam can be readily understood by a look at the amount of key supplies brought into Vietnam in 1966. Every month, 45,000 tons of ammunition, 60 million gallons of petroleum, 10 million food rations cross from the U.S. to Vietnam. By far, the greater amount comes by ship. In addition, thousands of tons of military cargo, including heavy weapons, vehicles, and equipment, must be stored, maintained, and distributed and serviced. How does the Army keep track of this vast input of costly combat material? Once at the coastal areas, how do the supplies actually get to the troops in the central highlands of South Vietnam? And what about the many essential logistical support services so necessary to the Army's mission? The answer to all of these questions lie in careful planning and organization by the logistical facilities in the Pacific. Until 1967, headquarters of the 2nd Logistical Command in Okinawa, Japan, was the marshalling point for Vietnam-bound supplies and equipment. But pressing and increased logistical needs required shipments of the vital combat material directly to South Vietnam for more immediate deployment. Okinawa still handles much of the heavy-duty maintenance of military equipment. It also still coordinates requisitions for supplies for combat units in Vietnam. The 1st Logistical Command is responsible for the distribution of oncoming combat supplies and equipment. This is the largest single Army troop command, with over 60,000 troop personnel trained in supply and maintenance operations. From ammunition to rations, from gasoline to bridges, from medical supplies to housing, the 1st Command supports the soldier in the field with everything he needs to sustain him in combat. Most supply items move by truck from depots to forward support areas close to the combat zone. Before setting out in the supply convoys, Army truck drivers are briefed on the possible hazards ahead. These truck drivers carry weapons and are trained to respond if the convoy is attacked. Road conditions in Vietnam are not always equal to the task. Many combat can't be reached at all by land routes. Where road access isn't possible, the precious cargo is brought in by helicopter. The Army's heavy-duty helicopter, the CH-47 Chinook, can carry everything from heavy construction equipment to an entire tribune directly into the battle zone. The long-haul's fixed cargo aircraft make the run from depot to forward support landing fields. Each forward support area keeps a stockpile of all classes of supplies geared for the particular type of unit it supports. From these stockpiles close to the battle area, combat units draw what they need to continue to fight. Whilst much of our troop strength can be supplied by land vehicles and aircraft, in the southern Mekong River Delta, supplies must come by water. A river reinforce of assault craft boats and barges carry the men and their combat material to battle. Maintenance barges can repair Army aircraft and military equipment on the spot. The watchword here is inspect and repair only as needed. The aim: get the equipment back to its combat unit with the least possible delay. Support for Army combat activity is performed by another important water-based facility, the Army aircraft maintenance ship Corpus Christi Bay, anchored off the coast of South Vietnam. It carries a team expertly trained for every maintenance specialty on router fixed-brain Army aircraft. Aboard the floating maintenance ship, critical hours or even days are saved in repairing equipment that might otherwise have to be sent to U.S. bases in the Pacific or back to the United States for maintenance. Forces in Vietnam require the same repair capabilities for dozens of other Army specialties: tanks, armored personnel carriers, and other combat vehicles must battle not only the enemy, but the rigors of heat, humidity, and difficult terrain. The Army's maintenance organization provides the support, from field repair close to the combat zone to the more complete maintenance facilities at the large logistical bases. Though surface transportation accounts for the major supply of movement in Vietnam, airlift is vitally important in getting essential repair parts to their destination. At Tan Son Nhi outside Saigon, the Red Ball Express expedites the flow of spare parts from military equipment of every kind. Red Ball shipments are given a higher transportation priority. Without spare parts, crucial equipment simply can't be repaired. Though supply and maintenance of troops and equipment form a cornerstone of the U.S. Army logistical effort, many other support services are indispensable to combat operations. American engineers paved the way for creation of logistical facilities. Engineers have developed new and more effective methods of clearing jungle regions for helicopter touchdown zones and landing strips for Army aircrafts. Airstrips too fast for the weight of heavy aircraft are prepared with specially designed synthetic surfaces. Army engineers also make sure that the troops have an adequate supply of safe drinking water. Water resources are constantly tested at purification plants before they're cleared for human consumption. Feeding our troops in Vietnam is a difficult logistical problem. Food is brought in by truck wherever possible, but with combat troops under fire in remote, hard-to-get-to areas, surface transportation can't always get through. In those cases, food and water come by air. If there's no place to land, the supplies are airdropped to the combat unit. Soldiers engaged in active fighting receive combat rations that are complete meals that may be eaten hot or cold. Care for the individual soldier has always been a major concern of the United States Army. Medical evacuation of wounded soldiers is one of the most important functions during wartime. This rescue hoist uses a specially rigged seat to lift casualties out of jungle regions. The rescue units coordinate with Army hospitals throughout Vietnam to evacuate wounded men to the nearest medical facility. Logistical support for the fighting man also includes providing for his relaxation. Entertainment is often arranged at base camps and hospitals. The casts of traveling shows must be provided with transportation and housing. Building the logistic train to supply the fighting men is not glamorous work, but it is, as we have seen, crucial to the American war effort. One can't help think when watching the end result of this long train that whatever battlefield innovations may come out of Vietnam, the new logistic techniques will prove just as important. Inevitably, success on the battlefield depends on total support in every phase of combat operations. Whatever the supplies or services required, the need is always urgent. The time is always now. The personnel that back up our fighting men with supplies, maintenance, and service are an army behind an army. They are, in fact, our pipeline to victory. Most wars are fought over the possession of territory. Vietnam is no different. From the southeastern corner of the Asian continent extends a peninsula divided into 6 countries. This area of the world, known as Indochina, has been fought over for centuries. To understand the conflict in Vietnam, we must start with the land and the people, the elements which make up this troubled country. It is a nation of diverse ethnic groups, a tribal land with 5 languages that is slowly inching toward the modern world, a land of seemingly limitless potential, haunted by history. The terrain of Vietnam varies from the terrain of the jungle to fog-cloaked mountain peaks. Highly seasonal monsoon rainfall varies monthly, from a trace to more than 15 inches. The people of Vietnam live sophisticated urban lives and eke out their existence as mountainside hunter-gatherers.
Always the jungle, tangled, hostile, forbidding. A jungle where the Viet Cong melted away into the dense undergrowth whenever attacked.
A sunny sandy beach, an ancient Asian temple, a sunny sidewalk cafe. Vietnam is a strange mosaic. The capital of Saigon, a city built for 500,000 people, crowded with more than 6 times that many. It is business as usual in Saigon, oblivious to the dull rumble of bombs only 15 miles away. Fashioned with the charm and beauty of colonial France, Saigon is a city jarred by the explosions of civil war. More than a decade ago, the French found out how difficult a war in Vietnam could be. Their modern, well-equipped army led down a road to staggering defeat. French casualties equaled more than 250,000 men, and Vietnam slipped out of its colonial grasp. The truce which effected the partition of Vietnam was uneasy, just a breather whilst the communists regrouped and began their infiltration of southern Vietnam. Now American forces are battling in the jungles of Vietnam. It is a war like no other, with stealthy guerrillas loitering unseen beneath the jungle canopy. Above them is America's answer, a new breed of helicopter that has changed warfare forever. The Army calls them Hueys. Over the years, the one constant in Vietnam has been the natural environment. A climate and terrain that actually precludes the kind of full-scale land warfare America perfected in World War II, when both terrain and climate make surface mobility a virtual impossibility. Helicopters become the key to success. Night has always been the ally of the guerrilla. In Vietnam, it was the time he moved his men and supplies, usually over the waterways that lace the countryside. But the sanctuary of darkness has been pierced. Low-flying Hueys sweep the rivers and canals, armed with exterior-mounted machine guns and 2.75-inch folding thin aerial rockets. Another version of the Bell U-81B has large pods carrying 48 rockets, more than enough firepower to destroy the links in the Ho Chi Minh Trail that connect the guerrilla with the supply base in North Vietnam. Dawn of almost any day in Vietnam begins with reconnaissance of a particular combat sector in preparation for airlifts of American and South Vietnamese troops. Hueys are woven through the entire operations of U.S. and RVN forces. This rotary wing aircraft performs 9 different types of missions, and one of the most important is the armed assault helicopter. The assault ships take off and climb to a relatively safe altitude of 1,500 feet, flying a free-floating staggered trail formation. Pilots take great care not to fly parallel to tree lines or roads, and not to follow each other for fear of enemy ground fire. Once the high sweep is complete, the gunships move lower, skimming the treetops as they pass back and forth. A thorough check takes a long time, and crossing back and forth across a jungle is not without risk. But the threat of ambush must be eliminated before the unarmed troop-carrying helicopters arrive. Back at base camp, American and Vietnamese soldiers are loaded into Hueys. They will be airlifted to an area where an enemy force is operating. In this war, the Huey virtually replaced the familiar 6x6 truck of World War II. Even the Jeep is of diminished importance here. It is left to the helicopters to carry the load. At the target area, the heavy fire teams have begun their job of softening up the selected landing zone. Firing passes begin about 2,500 yards from the target. 2 teams strike simultaneously, each directing its fire at half of the landing zone. Striking is concentrated in the areas which afford the Viet Cong cover and concealment. Assault techniques with helicopters are different from those used by a fixed-wing aircraft. Firing is usually broken off about 500 yards from the enemy, so that the slow-moving helicopter doesn't have to fly over the target and expose itself to ground fire. As the troop-carrying helicopters are on final approach, a light fire team flies into the landing area using flares to mark touchdown points for individual helicopters. A platoon of armed assault helicopters escorts a company of unarmed helicopters, suppressing ground fire as necessary. Experience has shown that suppressive fire is most critical just prior to touchdown or upon liftoff. The enemy has learned that in these few seconds of hovering close to the ground, the helicopter is most vulnerable to fire. The armed escort picks up the troop carriers as they move out. Once on the ground, the war becomes what infantry fighting has always been: fire and move, cover and conceal. In a war which has no single definitive front, combat operations take place at widely scattered locations, operations which require different tactics. South of Saigon, in the rice-rich delta, the order of the day may well be to flush small bands of individual guerrillas from the countryside. Armed Viet Cong bandits prey on the villagers, exacting high ransom and crops and money, spreading terror and assassination. But finding an enemy lying in a rice paddy breathing through a reed is difficult. Without a Huey, it would be almost impossible. There are some areas where the tactical situation precludes even a helicopter landing. In those cases, men have to be paradropped directly into the combat zone. The Huey also provides a vital role in search and rescue operations. When a pilot is down in enemy territory, there's no time to lose. Recovery teams propel from the hovering Huey and pluck even the disabled personnel from the most peerless environment or terrain in just a matter of minutes. The Huey does many jobs, like providing fire direction for the massive B-52 bombers of the Air Force. Flying close to the surface of the Earth, they are able to provide the precise degree of correction needed for effective high-altitude bombing. The Hueys can immediately assess the damage and evaluate the results of the bombing runs, calling in additional strikes if necessary. Helicopter mobility means small things as well as large. The luxury of a hot meal to combat-weary men who are tired of cold, canned rations. The necessities and the niceties all come from the sky, airlifted by Huey, a vital link in the logistics of today's Army. Even the few traditional convoys that venture overland routes rely on the Huey for protection. Armed assault Hueys warn off ambush by escorting the convoy missions. Like all countries in a monsoon region, the economy of Vietnam is strongly dependent on a complex network of rivers and canals. The seasonal rains make cross-country mobility virtually impossible for about 5 months of the year. There's probably more tonnage of supplies shipped by water than over land. An incredible variety of sandpans, canoes, and other shallow draft boats ply the waterways of Vietnam. Maintaining this vital artery of commerce requires constant patrol activity. Anywhere the American and Vietnamese troops go, Huey is there, providing reconnaissance, fire support, and transportation for the men who patrol these waterways, keeping the lines of commerce open. While the sound of helicopters on various missions can be heard throughout Vietnam, in the Central Plains, one major combat engagement is rapidly reaching a climax. As the Viet Cong attempt to break off and slip into the protective coloration of the surrounding countryside, American and Vietnamese troops can be leapfrogged over them to attack from a different direction or cut off an escape route. Using radio communications, the ground commander can get both a quick airlift for his troops and the aerial fire support needed to cover a flanking maneuver. Redeployment of troops can be done quickly, and the men arrive at their next engagement, rested and ready to fight. The swirling confusion of ground combat begins again. Every rice paddy is a possible battlefield, every hut a potential ambush. Casualties are inevitable. Even with the growth of the helicopter in filling the Army's varied needs, its primary function remains the same: aerial ambulance. In Southeast Asia, more than 30,000 wounded have been airlifted by helicopter. Medical corpsmen are in the field, but in a matter of minutes, wounded can be airlifted out of combat to hospitals, receiving the best modern medical attention. This rapid medical evacuation has dramatically reduced the mortality rate for men fighting in Vietnam. In World War II, 4.5% of the wounded reaching hospitals died. In Vietnam, a man's chances are 5 times better. Less than 1% of those who arrive alive die, and with the mobility of helicopters, a greater percentage than ever arrive alive. As the firing sputters into silence, we realize again that combat is never pretty. But in Vietnam, it is even uglier than usual. Recovery of the combat unit is easily made after the area has been secured. Hueys can land in flooded rice paddies, where even waiting is difficult, and take off with a full load of troops and equipment. This whole helicopter-centered operation is typical of how the wealth of our nation is being used to reduce the hazard of war for the American soldier. Money is being spent rather than lives. Never before have we seen a war with such a fantastic level of firepower. Never in history has an army been supported by the mobility and firepower helicopters provide. Perhaps the greatest paradox about the Hueys in Vietnam is that they have suffered very few losses to enemy ground fire. Although they fly slower, lower, and in more constant exposure to enemy fire than fixed-wing aircraft, they have shown the ability to perform evasive maneuvers. The mobility and flexibility and durability of the Huey has changed the nature of warfare forever.